The houses were gone. Not burned, not broken, taken down, carefully, plank by plank, and carried away by people who had time and no reason to hurry. It was the 18th of August, 1590. An Englishman named John White stood on the shore of a small island off the coast of what we now call North Carolina, and found the place where he had left more than 100 people 3 years before. His neighbors, his friends, his daughter, and a little girl who, on this exact day, was turning 3 years old. There was no one there. No bodies, no graves, no sign of a struggle. Just the shape where a village had been and the wind coming off the water. And then he saw it, carved into a wooden post in capital letters, one word: Croatoan. They had agreed on a signal before he left. If they were ever in danger, they would carve a cross. He searched the post and the tree beside it. There was no cross. To understand why that empty shore would haunt a man for the rest of his life, you have to understand who John White was and what he had left behind. White was not a soldier. He was an artist, a painter and a map maker, one of the finest England had. Years earlier, he had sailed to these same shores and filled his notebooks with watercolors, the villages of the Algonquian peoples who lived here, their fishing weirs, their dances, the strange and beautiful creatures of a coast no Englishman had ever drawn. He did not paint this place like a conqueror. He painted it like a man falling in love with it. So when England decided to try once more to build a permanent colony in the New World, White was chosen to lead it. And this time, it would be different. The earlier attempts had been military, men with armor and guns. This one carried families, ordinary Londoners, carpenters and tilers and their wives, around 115 men, women and children, sailing across the Atlantic to begin a new life in a place they had never seen. Among them was White's own daughter, Eleanor. She was pregnant, and her husband, Ananias Dare, had come too. They landed in the summer of 1587, and a few weeks later, on the 18th of August, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, the first English child ever born in the Americas. They named her Virginia Dare. White was a grandfather now, and everything that happened next, he would measure against that one small life. But Roanoke was not empty ground waiting to be filled. It was already, in a sense, cursed, and the people who cursed it were the English themselves. This was the age of Queen Elizabeth. England was a small, hungry nation watching Spain grow rich on the gold of the Americas and desperate for a foothold of its own. The man who would plant that foothold was Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier, a schemer, a favourite of the Queen, who held a royal charter to claim new land in her name. Raleigh never came himself. He sent others. It had begun 6 years earlier with something close to wonder. In 1584, the very first English ships to reach these shores were met not with arrows, but with kindness. The Algonquian peoples who lived along this coast, the Secatan, the Roanoke, the Croatoan and their neighbors, were not a wilderness to be tamed. They were farmers and fishermen and traders living in ordered towns, governed by their own leaders, with their own law and language and faith. The English who first came among them wrote home in astonishment at how generous, how gentle, how civilized they found these people to be. Two of those men, Manteo and Wanchese, even agreed to sail back to England, where they became a sensation at court. It could have been the beginning of something extraordinary. Instead, in the space of a single year, the English threw it all away. Because the men Raleigh sent next did not come to live alongside these people. They came to be fed by them and to rule them. In 1585, 2 years before White's families arrived, a military expedition built a fort on Roanoke under a hard, impatient governor named Ralph Lane. They arrived expecting to be fed by the land and by their neighbors. Instead, they ran short of food and leaned on the local Algonquian villages until the goodwill ran out. When a silver cup went missing, the English burned an entire village in revenge. And then it got worse. As relations collapsed, Lane's men turned on the most powerful leader in the region, a man the English knew as Wingina, who had taken the name Pemisapan. In the summer of 1586, they killed him. They cut off his head. That is the ground the families of 1587 were sent to live on, a place where the English had already lied, burned, and murdered, where a young colony had already starved and fled, abandoning a small group of men who were never seen again. There was one thread of hope, and his name was Manteo. Manteo was a member of the Croatoan people who lived on the Barrier Islands to the south. He had sailed to England twice, learned the language, and chosen, remarkably, to remain a friend to the newcomers. There was also a second man, one Cheesy, who had made the opposite choice and turned against them. One open door, one closed. The colonists of 1587 were walking straight between them, and they had no idea how narrow the gap had become. The trouble began before they even landed. The plan had never been to settle on Roanoke at all. White's colonists were bound for the Chesapeake Bay further north, better harbors, better land, and, crucially, distance from the enemies Ralph Lane had made. But the fleet's pilot, a hard Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. When they stopped at Roanoke to check on the men left behind, Fernandez refused to take the colonists any further. He put them ashore on the wrong island and would not carry them on. To this day, no one is entirely sure why. Impatience. The sailing season closing in. A privateer eager to be rid of his passengers and back to the profitable business of hunting Spanish ships. Some have even wondered whether it was deliberate, whether someone wanted this colony left exactly where it would be hardest to save. Whatever the reason, it may have been the single decision that doomed them all. They were on Roanoke now, the very place the English had turned into a graveyard of trust. What they found there cannot have reassured them. The fort Ralph Lane's men had built was standing, but empty, and of the small party of soldiers left behind to hold it, there was no trace but bones and a collapsing shelter overtaken by the forest. These families had crossed an entire ocean, women and children among them, only to arrive at a ruin haunted by the disappearance of the men who came before. And the summer was already turning. The warnings came fast. One of the colonists, a man named George Howe, wandered out alone to catch crabs in the shallows. He was found dead, killed by men who had every reason to hate the sight of an Englishman. You can imagine what that did to them. 115 people, many of them women, many of them children, standing on a strip of sand between the ocean and a coastline where their own countrymen had made enemies of nearly everyone. Winter was coming. Their supplies, already stretched thin by the long crossing, would not carry them through it. They could not simply buy or beg food from their neighbors, because their neighbors had every reason to want them gone. Every friendship the first English had, the first English had burned. They did have Manteo. With his help, White tried to mend what Lane had broken, reaching out to the Croatoan for peace. But it went wrong almost at once. In the confusion and fear, the colonists struck before dawn at a village they believed to be hostile and discovered too late that they had fallen upon their own Croatoan friends come to gather the abandoned crops of their enemies. "We were deceived," White wrote afterwards. "The men they had attacked were our friends." Even their attempts at friendship were turning to blood. And into that fear, on the 18th of August, Ellen Adair gave birth to Virginia. A baby changes the arithmetic of survival. It sharpens every fear, and it forced the colony to face a hard truth. They did not have enough to last. Someone had to go back to England for supplies. Someone trusted. Someone whose word would move Raleigh to send ships. They chose John White. He did not want to go. He argued against it. He knew how it would look. The governor abandoning his people, sailing home while they faced the winter. He worried they would think he had run, but they pressed him. They needed a voice in England that could not be ignored, and his was the loudest they had. Before he left, they made a promise to each other. If they moved from Roanoke while he was gone, and they were already talking about moving inland about 50 miles into the mainland, they would leave word. They would carve the name of their destination where he would find it. And if they left in danger, under attack or by force, they would carve a cross above it. A name for safety, a cross for danger. On the 27th of August, 1587, John White boarded the ship. He looked back at the shore, at his daughter, at his son-in-law, at a 9-day-old baby girl. He would never see any of them again. He meant to be gone a few months. He came home to a country bracing for annihilation. By the time White reached England in the autumn of 1587, the whole nation was staring across the Channel at Spain. King Philip was assembling the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, the Armada, and every English ship, every sailor, every barrel of powder was being pulled into the coming war. The Queen forbade vessels from leaving. White stood in the middle of it, frantic, useless, with a colony across the ocean waiting for the sails that could not come. Every argument he made, every door he knocked on, met the same answer. There are no ships. Not for a colony, not for your daughter. England was fighting for its life, and one small settlement on the far side of the world simply did not matter to anyone but him. He managed to beg 2 small ships loose in the spring of 1588, vessels too little to matter to the war. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Instead of sailing straight for Roanoke, their crews went hunting for Spanish prizes on the way and were themselves attacked by French pirates. Men were killed. The supplies meant for White's family were looted from the hold. The battered ships crawled back to England, empty. And then the war swallowed everything. The Armada came. England survived it, but the seas stayed closed month after month, and the months became years. Try to hold both halves of this in your mind at once. On one side of the ocean, an old man ashore in England, watching every sailing season slip past, knowing exactly what he had left on that beach. On the other side, 115 people and a little girl growing from a baby into a toddler, waiting for a ship on the horizon that never appeared. One winter, then another, then another. Imagine being one of them. Imagine standing on that shore through the first autumn, scanning the horizon every morning, telling the children that Grandfather White is coming, that the ships are only late. Imagine the first winter closing in and the food running low and the neighbors who will not help. Imagine a second spring and a third, and slowly understanding the truth that no one wants to say aloud. No one is coming. We have been forgotten. And whatever we do now, we do alone. At some point, we don't know when, they stopped waiting. They made their choice. They took their houses down plank by plank so that nothing useful would be left to rot, and they walked away from the sea toward whatever safety 115 desperate people could still hope to find. And 3 years after he had left them, John White finally got his ship. It was August 1590 when he came back within sight of the coast. As they approached in the dark, the crew saw smoke rising from the island. White's heart must have leapt. He had the sailors sound a trumpet and sing English songs across the water so that the colonists would know their own people had come. No one answered. On the morning of the 18th of August, his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, he finally set foot on Roanoke and found the silence we began with. The dismantled houses, the empty ground, his own buried chests dug up and ransacked, his armor left to rust in the damp, and carved on the post, that single word, Croatoan, no cross. To White, that was everything. No cross meant no disaster. It meant they had gone of their own free will to Croatoan, Manteo's island, the home of the one people who had stayed his friends. His family was not dead. They were 50 miles down the coast. He simply had to go and find them. He never got the chance. That night, a storm rolled in. The ship's anchor cables snapped in the heavy sea, one after another, until there was barely enough left to hold her. The captain would not risk the shoals. And so, with the wind rising and Croatoan just out of reach, John White was carried out onto the open Atlantic, away from the island, away from the word carved in the post, away from his daughter and his granddaughter. He was blown across the ocean, all the way to the Azores, and then home to England, empty-handed once more. And this time, there would be no going back. White pleaded for another expedition, but the money was gone. Raleigh's attention had moved on, and no one would fund a voyage to rescue people most now assumed were already dead. Some years later, from a quiet house in Ireland, John White wrote down what had happened. His words are those of a broken man who has made his peace with defeat and cannot forgive himself for it. He committed his family, he wrote, to the mercy of God and to whatever help they could find among the people of that country. It was the closest thing to a goodbye he was ever allowed. That letter, written in 1593, is very nearly the last we ever hear of him. He is believed to have died soon after, where and exactly when we do not know, never learning what had become of the people he left behind, or of the little girl who shared her birthday with the day he came too late. For more than 400 years, that empty shore has done to us what it did to John White. It will not let go. The word lost has fixed itself to Roanoke like a curse. The lost colony vanished into thin air, swallowed by the wilderness. But that word may be the biggest lie in the whole story, because the evidence we have does not point to a vanishing. It points quietly and stubbornly to survival. Think about what White actually found. Not a massacre, not scattered bones. Homes taken down with care, and a signpost with no cry for help. A colony that packed up and went somewhere, and told him where. That somewhere was Croatoan. And in the sandy soil of Hatteras Island, where the Croatoan people lived, archaeologists have been pulling English things out of the ground. The hilt of a gentleman's sword, a writing slate, fragments of English pottery, sitting in the middle of a Native American town. 50 miles inland, at the head of the Sound, exactly where the colonists had spoken of moving, and exactly where a hidden fort symbol was found, concealed beneath a patch on White's own map. A second team has found more. The leading explanation today is the most human one imaginable. Facing a winter they could not survive alone, the colonists most likely did the only sensible thing. They split up. They went to the people who would take them in, the Croatoan, and perhaps others inland. And they were absorbed, over the years, into indigenous families. The English who came later to Jamestown and beyond heard rumours for generations of grey-eyed people, of villages where some spoke of English ancestors. There is something quietly just about that possibility. The people the English had lied to, stolen from, and murdered may, in the end, have been the ones who kept the survivors of that same England alive, took in their children and made them family. If the leading theory is right, the lost colony was never destroyed by the New World. It was saved by it. It simply stopped being English. But we have to be honest, in the way John White himself tried to be honest. We cannot prove it. There are no confirmed graves, no certain descendants, no final answer. Modern researchers have even turned to genetics, searching for a thread of shared blood between the colonists and the families of the coast. And so far, it has yielded nothing conclusive. The frauds have not helped either. The notorious Dare stones, carved rocks that claimed to record Eleanor Dare's own account of the colony's fate, drew headlines for years before most were exposed as an elaborate hoax. The honest truth is that we still do not know with certainty what became of Eleanor Dare or of the first English child born in this land. But perhaps lost was always the wrong word. Perhaps they were not lost at all, only taken in by the very people England had wronged, and folded so completely into a new world that they became impossible to find. John White died believing his family was still out there, alive, 50 miles down a coast he could not reach. 4 centuries later, the ground is beginning to suggest that he was right.